Thank you very much for attending the long-awaited Teaching Palestine in the Present event. We have survived several rounds of UCU strike action, as well as people returning back to normal under COVID conditions, which has meant getting people together in different time zones, much more difficult than usual. Today's roundtable is an opportunity for us to have a conversation, but also to reflect on our existing and also growing community of scholars and also advocates who are working on teaching about Palestine or raising awareness about human rights issues in relation to Palestine in different settings, both academia and also civil society as well. I am not going to make a big introduction because I will be your chair, and my name is Teodora Todorova, and I'm an academic based at the University of Warwick, and I'm also BRISMES Council and the chair of the BRISMES Subcommittee on Outreach and Pedagogy. I also want to make you aware of the fact that we will have an upcoming event in October, which please do look out for, that is going to look at culture, poetry, filmmaking, and also music in the Middle East. And in today's event, we are going to have a range of speakers who make contributions on the present moment in terms of the ability, but also the type of teaching in terms of creativity and also rigor that is being done in relation to teaching Palestine. I'm afraid that Maya Abu Mogli has had to leave us last minute for good reasons. Her family has finally been able to visit her after a long absence, and so it's not a negative reason that she's had to drop out. So we'll change the way in which the panelists appear slightly. So each panelist will have about 8 minutes to make contributions, beginning with Professor Nicola Pratt, followed by Tamara Ben-Halim from MAKAN. Then we will have Giovanni Fassina from the ELSC, Martin Konečný from the European Middle East Project, and last but not least, John Chalcraft, who is a professor of Middle East Studies at the London School of Economics, and also BRISMES Council will bring the roundtable together. And finally, Yara Hawari, who is here as someone representing Al-Shabaka, will respond to the roundtable contributions as a way to open up the discussion to you. And the idea is that once we open up the discussion to those of you who are participating today, you will also share your experiences of being teachers and lecturers, academics, researchers, and advocates in relation to Palestinian pedagogy. Thank you very much. And without further ado, I will hand over to Nicola.
Hi everyone, and thanks for coming today. And it's really a pleasure to be part of this roundtable. This is a topic that is very close to my heart, as well as being an important part of my professional experience. So who am I? I am a professor of the international politics of the Middle East at the University of Warwick, and I've been teaching Middle East politics since I began my career as a lecturer. So that's my first lectureship was in 2004 at the University of East Anglia. And since 2008, so when I was at the University of East Anglia, I began a new module that focused solely on Israel-Palestine. And then I took that module with me to Warwick. I've been teaching it there, and I've sort of restructured it over time. Yeah, I'm quite happy. It's an ongoing, but I always find that with modules that you teach, that every year, you know, like it's an ongoing process of getting the module to work and to cover the material in a way that works best for the students. So I want to say a little bit about my experience, since I have this long experience of teaching, well, relatively long experience of teaching Israel-Palestine. So I just want to say something about that experience and how it's changed over time. So one thing I should stress is, obviously, as I'm in a politics and international relations department, my approach to teaching Israel-Palestine has obviously been within that framework of mainly international relations theories, and also I've always thought it's important to bring in and have, well, the historical background is really important to understanding the conflict. However, over time, I've condensed the historical material, which doesn't appeal so much to politics students, and stressed much more on the international relations aspects. So one thing I'm going to start off with some reflections about how things have changed, maybe for the worse over time, but then I'm going to finish on a happy note and just highlight the positive things, the positive changes that have occurred over time in my experience of teaching Israel-Palestine. So the bad news is that since I first began teaching Israel-Palestine, there's been increasing scrutiny of teaching or courses that are taught on Israel-Palestine, and that scrutiny has come both from some external parties, but also it comes from within the university, from students who are supporters of Israel. So as a result, so I could say when I was at the University of East Anglia, I never had anybody ever complain about any of the materials I was teaching. I used to organize events on Israel-Palestine, and supporters of Israel would come along and they would engage in debate, and obviously they would, we would disagree, but it was done mostly in a very collegial way. However, over time, my experience is that not only do people object to some of the materials that you teach, or the approaches that you have to teaching, the narratives about the conflict, about that you might perhaps foreground over others that supporters of Israel think are the truth. So not only do you get complaints, so what happens is that none of this happens to your face. You don't have students who come and want to engage in debate with you. Instead, you have people making complaints to your head of department, or even higher up in the university. When this happens on a regular basis, you begin to feel a bit paranoid. You feel like you're being monitored and surveyed. It's not a very comfortable position to be in. And you begin to become very, very careful about the way you phrase things. And certainly, other colleagues have got into really awful situations where comments they've made have been taken completely out of context, and stories have been released to the media. So this is all rather intimidating. And on top of that, since 2016, we have the IHRA definition that the UK government adopted and has promoted, has sort of pressured universities to adopt this IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. I'm going to assume that most people know what the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is. That's the most important thing to say about this definition is the way in which it conflates anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism or criticisms of Israel, through the so-called examples that are attached to the definition. And the effect of that has been to sort of increase this chilling environment that exists on university campuses when discussing Israel-Palestine. And in particular for students, it's created a lot of confusion over what you can and can't say about Israel. So, you know, this is a very worrying development. And unfortunately, in the UK, university management, university vice chancellors are really not taking any sort of lead in sort of pushing back against attempts to stifle speech on Israel. And in many cases, unfortunately not so far at Warwick, but in other universities, you know, there's been really worrying cases of where universities have actually given into external pressure or internal pressure and, you know, either censored certain things, whether that's articles or speakers or what have you. So this is all really, really worrying. But like I said, I want to finish by stressing some positive developments that I think are really, you know, these are the things that this is the silver lining, if you like. So first and foremost, I'd say that I have noted quite a significant shift in students' perception of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. I use that shorthand. It's really, I should have said at the beginning, obviously, it's not a conflict between Israel and Palestine. It is a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, or it's Israeli colonialism. But, you know, I use this shorthand Israel-Palestine conflict. I get used to using it as a sort of neutral term, but always with the caveats that, you know, it's not a conflict between an entity called Israel and an entity called Palestine. Anyway, that's probably something that could also be discussed further. But what I want to say is that the way in which students perceive the situation in Israel-Palestine has shifted over time. So when I first started teaching in 2008, I would say that most students were either like, oh, it's sort of 50-50, you know, like each side's to blame, each side has done something wrong. You know, we just have to find a way to bring them together and negotiate and have a peace settlement. And I think now students are much, on the whole, students in the last few years, I've seen a marked shift towards students being a lot more critical about how the mainstream media portray Israel-Palestine. And I think it's because also their own, you know, their news sources are not really the mainstream media anymore. Their main news sources are often things on social media, and also I think students have also been very influenced in the last few years through, you know, the movement to decolonize the curriculum at universities, to bring in, and also of course the Black Lives Matter movement, and sort of the whole questioning of how knowledge is produced and taught on university campuses. So students are and I'm not saying all students, but many more students are now much more sympathetic to a paradigm that understands what's happening in Israel-Palestine as a settler colonial context. And this has also been aided greatly by the increased scholarship on Israel-Palestine that uses the settler colonial paradigm, as well as what I found particularly useful is an expansion in the field of international relations of decolonial and anti-colonial approaches. So I have a much I feel like I have a much stronger intellectual justification now when I teach my course in the way that I do, to point to decolonial, anti-colonial IR scholarship, to point to scholarship using settler colonial paradigms, and that these are, you know, if the university is at all serious, which of course we know it's not really serious, the universities are not really serious about these things, these are all sort of marketing ploys, but nonetheless we can use that rhetoric of decolonizing the curriculum as a way of, it becomes a way to sort of help protect yourself from these accusations that come regularly towards you about potential bias or even anti-Semitism in the way that Israel-Palestine is taught. So that's it for me. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Nicola. I look forward to all of us being together so we can clap. Tamara, I shall be messaging you in the box when you have 2 minutes left, and then a minute, if that is okay. And without further ado, I shall hand over to you.
Thanks, Teodora. Thanks for organizing this. Thanks to BRISMES. And thanks, Nicola, for kicking us off. I'll just do a quick kind of introduction and context, and then speak more specifically about the work of MAKAN, where I'm co-director and co-founder, which is an educational organization on Palestine in the UK. Just from on a personal note, Tamara Ben-Halim, I'm a British Palestinian Libyan. I have spent most of my life in London, but grew up the first 10 years of my life in Saudi Arabia amongst a largely Palestinian, Syrian, Lebanese community. Thinking a little bit about why I, along with others, was involved in starting MAKAN, I think I trace it back quite strongly to my experiences of growing up in London, going to a British school, and particularly to, I would say, the Second Intifada, along with the invasion of Iraq and September 11th and everything else that was happening at that time. But particularly, I was around 16 years old when the Second Intifada happened. That was the first thing that started to really spark my political consciousness in general and on Palestine. Whereas before it was mainly, you know, hearing my grandmother's stories, like so many other Palestinians. And it was really a kind of a very sudden process of trying to understand beyond the headlines, and being thrown into this situation at my school, where I was certainly the only Arab and half Palestinian and Muslim in my year. And finding myself isolated and having to try to push back against very pro-Israel narratives and talking points that we all know very well, to provide a Palestinian perspective, and suddenly almost feeling like I had to be a representative. And I think probably most Palestinians have felt this at one point or another. Having to deal with, you know, the pushback with very little knowledge and understanding against the talking points of, oh, you know, Palestinians are terrorists, they're all violent, the Israeli army is doing what it needs to do in order to respond to this violence, etc. In that sense, not much has changed, but I am also hopeful, and I'll come to that. It also threw up a lot of questions of identity around, you know, what it was actually the Second Intifada that made me kind of feel Palestinian at all in the first place, which I always think is quite interesting. And this among kind of a broader context within my school, where teaching history at a kind of a GCSE level, and before that, leading up to that, was very much based on 3 or 4 specific topics: the Tudors, the number of wives that Henry VIII had and the various ways in which he killed them, and a deep dive into the First and Second World Wars, but of course only from the perspective of the victors and of Britain in particular. So no sense of global history, no sense of colonial history, no sense of history beyond Britain at all, or told through perspectives of those that suffered Britain's colonial rule. And this is something that I started to gradually see over time, but obviously I had no concept of while I was there in that moment. Looking back, I had no avenues through which to learn more, whether to explore my growing identity as Palestinian or half Palestinian, or to educate myself more. There was no social media at the time. So it was really not until I went to Palestine while I was at university that trip and all of those experiences and conversations kicked off, and visiting family kicked off a trajectory that got me more and more focused on the Palestinian struggle and issue. And later on, after studying for my master's, that was when I really started thinking about, okay, it's clear that there's a lot of great work happening on the university level amongst students, but how can we make that process easier? How can we make it easier for people to come and learn about Palestine and engage with it without having to so proactively seek it out? And how can we be involved in facilitating and easing that process? So I'll turn to where MAKAN comes in. In late 2014, early 2015, in the wake of the attacks on Gaza, I think many of us were witnessing that despite still very problematic narratives and framing in the mainstream, there was a shift that was happening. And I think many of us look back at 2014 and see that as part of one of those narrative shifts that helped us, or helped build the momentum that we're working on today. And we really wanted to think about how, as Palestinians in diaspora, we could fill what we saw as a niche where more Palestinian voices could be heard, where people could come and build their knowledge and become more confident to be able to speak about Palestine without necessarily having to be experts, knowing the basics, of course, but without having to be experts on the issue or feel like they had to know every single detail or nuance. And that, of course, wasn't just about taking a university course, which was hugely valuable, but something that many people might not be invested enough in, but building something that was dynamic and also responsive to different educational and knowledge needs. So we built an educational training organization that became registered as a UK charity in 2016. I should say that I co-founded MAKAN alongside a colleague and dear friend, Tariq Bakani. It was really about building a training outfit that would provide political education on Palestine through specifically curated workshops and training that work to build knowledge, as well as strengthen communication skills, learn how to debunk common misconceptions and reclaim the narrative on Palestine, Israel. And that also really encouraged people to question or rethink the framing that they're used to, that they're very often used to when thinking about and understanding and talking about Palestine, and shifting that towards a framing of understanding Israel as a settler colonial state, the Palestinian struggle as an anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggle. So, I mean, I won't talk too much about the specifics of our work, but just to give a quick sense, much of what we cover, and it's interesting, Nicola raised this, we've always had the tension between how much do you cover in terms of history versus what's happening now. We've always felt, of course, that it's crucial to talk about the history, but of course, there's limited kind of ability to focus and engage on that. So it's really a combination of trying to understand Palestinian historical events from a Palestinian perspective to be able to inform and understand how we got to where we are today, understanding Zionism as settler colonialism, understanding the strengths and limits of international law and how to use it to our advantage, understanding apartheid as a crime under international law and Palestine as an anti-racist issue. That's just to give a little bit of a flavor of some of the work that we do. And so much of this work really is not about producing altogether new content. There is so much content that is out there on Palestine. I'm being given time, sorry, I've just seen this. I'll wrap up in the next 30 seconds. It's about synthesizing, streamlining, and curating. And that's really what a lot of our work comes down to. And then the last thing I would just say before I hand over is that over time we've realized that a lot of our work has been about producing an alternative educational model to what is available traditionally in school and higher education curricula on Palestine, Israel, for the obvious reasons of the problematic framings that others have spoken about and will, I'm sure, of the need to be neutral, even in situations of oppression, the difficulties of talking about anti-colonialism in liberal Britain. And really our work, finally, I'd say, is just focused, like the work of many others on Palestine and on other social justice movements and work, is trying to make the seemingly complex accessible, to fight the misconception that things are too complicated, and ensuring that people have access to Palestinian thought, knowledge, production, and voices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Thank you. I shall hand over to Giovanni.
Thanks, Teodora. Hi, everyone. My name is Giovanni Fassina, and I am the director of the European Legal Support Center. I have a background. I was an activist in Italy on Palestine Solidarity Movement and other social movement, and been in Palestine several times. And before I was working in a law firm in Italy. And the European Legal Support Center is, in this very short presentation, I will just discuss a little bit what we're doing and some of the cases we won in the last years. So the European Legal Support Center is an initiative of the Palestinian NGO network, which is a network of over 200 Palestinian civil society organizations and the Dutch NGO The Rights Forum. And we've been established in January 2019, precisely with a mandate to provide legal assistance and support, strategic support, to people advocating for Palestinian rights in Europe. And so indeed, our work is focused on 3 pillars, which are monitor, defend, and empower. So on the one side, we constantly collect incidents of repression that are taking place in different European countries. And when it comes to defend, since we have the main, very ambitious goal to assist people in 27 different countries and so jurisdictions, which is very challenging, because, for instance, I do not know, I must admit, UK law or Dutch law. We work basically as a filter between our clients and the lawyers. So our clients are academics, students, civil society organizations, cultural and artistic organizations, who are facing a wide range of issues, from smear campaigns to unlawful dismissal, facing disciplinary proceeding before like university or other public bodies, closure of bank accounts, all this related to because of the work they do, of course, on Palestine, basically. So when a client come to us, we do a first screening, a first assessment of the situation. We try to understand what are the main needs of the person, because sometimes people need a network of support. Like when someone faces smear campaigns, you need more like someone expert on communication, because, you know, for instance, in the UK, making filing lawsuit for defamation very expensive, so it's not what we suggest. But when we realize, so we do a first screening, and then when we realize that actually a legal representation is needed, we have a network of lawyers in different countries, in the UK, of course, but mainly also in the Netherlands and in Germany. And then we do what is called co-counseling, in a sense that the lawyer is carrying out the main work, but we develop a niche expertise in rebutting allegation of support of terrorism or anti-Semitism. And we make sure that the case, how the legal arguments are developed, is in line also with what the narrative should be about the case. And we make sure that all the actors involved are well coordinated. And this brings me exactly to discuss some of the cases that we have working on, especially in academia, because I think what Nicola was saying was true. University are dealing with this in a very dodgy way, if I can say. And so in the last years, we assisted dozens of academics, but also students who were facing disciplinary proceeding due to unfounded allegation of anti-Semitism. And what we noticed indeed is that in all these cases, the kind of support that people require is different. First of all, in my opinion, what I learned is that, again, like mere legal support is meaningless. What people need is, first of all, psychological support and being able to listen to people and be able to provide them that kind of support. And also establish a network also. So establish immediately a network of civil society organizations, but also colleagues, friends that can support the person affected. And then, of course, there is the legal aspect, because then our role is been to show university that these allegations were unfounded. And again, my experience, what I noticed is that the university are extremely, they adopt a very bureaucratic and negligent approach on these things, which unfold in Kafkaesque process, I must say, literally. But on the other side, you know, since these complaints are made by pressure groups, pro-Israel pressure groups, what we notice is that what is successful is to build counter pressure, basically. And counter pressure can be built in two ways. If the case is confidential, and most of the time these cases were confidential, we build counter pressure by loading the university with paperwork and filing hundreds of pages of submissions to make sure the university understood that the person on the investigation is not alone, and they knew very well their rights. And this has been successful, because in all the cases we have been working on, all the complaints have been dropped, dismissed. Sometimes the cases were dismissed even before starting the investigations. After other cases, the investigation was carried out, and in the end, the complaints were dropped eventually. This, in my opinion, has been really a successful tool. And also, of course, sometimes it's also important to go public. And we'll refer to the case of Shahad Abu Salama. Shahad is a PhD candidate at University of Sheffield Hallam, and she was subjected to a smear campaign and led by pro-Israel groups, and she was suspended from teaching and put under investigation. Shahad is a really strong person, so she reclaimed her agency on this topic, and the network of support that was established through the union and through students group and other academic colleagues has been really important. And so through the pressure exerted by this network group, plus some of the legal response we sent to the university, we made sure that, you know, the investigation was immediately dropped, and actually Shahad received even a better work contract, because she had a precarious, she has a casual contract before. So also these cases, in my opinion, are positive, and I always try to remain optimistic. Actually, in front of my laptop, I always have the quote of Gramsci, which is the optimism of the will, because I think this is extremely important in order to keep moving forward. And yeah, eventually what I learned indeed that in these cases, what is really important is to be strategic. So when you are under pressure, don't panic, don't be impulsive, and also don't make the news public immediately, but think about who are your trusted colleagues, trusted friends, go to them. I will share, of course, our contacts, and you can reach us. But you know, the more strategic we are, the better, the most we can achieve. This is what I learned basically. And yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Perfectly timed. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Giovanni. I will now hand over to Martin. Martin, you have 8 minutes, and I will communicate the time in the chat box. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to this discussion. My name is Martin Konečný. I'm running European Middle East project in Brussels, which is a small kind of expert outfit focusing specifically on the European role and European policies on Israel-Palestine. And I want to talk today about one political issue, which is very much related to pedagogy and schools and textbooks, and that is the EU's preoccupation with the issue of Palestinian textbooks, which has really reached extraordinary levels over the past year. Just today, there was another vote in the European Parliament in which the Parliament passed a paragraph deploring hateful materials in the Palestinian textbooks, which is not immediately consequential, but it's the latest example of this textbook circus, you could say, which has been taking place in Brussels and across the EU over the last year. And the Parliament is very divided on this issue. Sometimes these things pass, sometimes they don't. So today it's an example of when it passed, and there is something on this happening in the EU institutions basically every week over the last months. Also in the Commission and in the Council, which is the member states, they have spent over the last year more time on this issue than on anything else related to Israel-Palestine, such as marginal issues like ending the occupation or abuses of human rights. And the issue is really reaching the highest levels. In the European Commission, what is at stake, or what is at the center of this attention is a proposal for making EU funds for the Palestinian Authority conditional on revisions of the textbooks. This proposal has been initiated and is being advanced by Commissioner Oliver Varhey, who is from Hungary and was nominated by Viktor Orbán. And he has been very keen to play this issue up and to advance it, which has resulted into a really large and growing dispute with most member states who are opposed to this. As a result of this dispute, the entire EU financial assistance to the Palestinian Authority is blocked, is stuck. It's not, that the EU has itself decided to block the aid for the Palestinian Authority because of the textbooks, but that because of this internal dispute about the textbooks, there is no agreement to move ahead and release the funding. And the EU is a key donor to the Palestinian assistance. So this actually has really serious consequences on the grounds. For example, East Jerusalem hospitals, which now have to refuse cancer patients because they lack funding. I guess many of the people here are from the UK, where this issue has also been quite prominent in the last years. But in the EU, it has really gone further. And it started with this kind of current level of attention over the last year. It started with a study of the textbooks by a German institute, the Georg Eckert Institute, which is one of the most reputed institutes dealing with textbooks in the world. So I think it's an interesting case study of kind of intersection of politics and academia. the accusations on this topic on Palestinian textbooks, they have been around for more than 20 years, and it was always a sort of seen as a kind of a pet issue of organizations in Israel and other organizations internationally who are aligned with the Israeli government, who have been claiming that the textbooks promote incitement to hatred, violence, and anti-Semitism. But yeah, over the last year, it has really become much bigger at the political level in the EU. So I think it's an issue that would deserve more critical attention from academics and activists, Palestinian and international, both the content itself, what's in the textbooks, but also the issue as a political, a remarkable political phenomenon. It is a difficult issue to engage on because, of course, there is some questionable content in the textbooks, nationalist content, as one would expect in a situation of conflict and occupation, and never-ending occupation. But it cannot be dismissed completely as mere fake news. But the thing is that it is being exaggerated, and exaggerated big time, torn out of context. There are examples which are cherry-picked, and they get torn out of context and distorted by organizations and politicians who are invested in it. And I would really put emphasis on the politicians in Europe, who, some of them uncritically buy into these claims and amplify them. And this is also how the issue actually landed so high on the agenda. The same politicians, never express concern about the occupation itself, the violations of human rights. So it is clearly being used as an issue to shift blame to the Palestinians, to divert attention from the core issues on the ground, and to, I would say, almost demonize the Palestinians, and to feed into this kind of a long-standing Israeli narrative, which claims that Palestinians teach their children to hate, which is supposedly one of the core causes of the conflict and violence. So in a way, these claims are similar to what the same organizations and people claim about the Palestinian textbooks, as if they demonize. Well, here we also have a clear case of attempts to kind of demonize the other. Now, I guess I don't need to emphasize that while this is being made an EU priority, there is no attention whatsoever to the content of Israeli textbooks. And also, given that the EU is really doing very little, certainly over the last year, to end the occupation or end the human rights abuses, then it just shows how selective, extremely selective this focus is. And even if we put aside the Israeli side of the issue, if you want to put pressure on the Palestinian Authority, I would argue there are much more fundamental issues there that the Europeans should address, such as the lack of elections, which were canceled or indefinitely postponed last year. I would, and Teodora, please stop me when my time runs out, but I will talk a little bit more, if I may, about the Georg Eckert Institute's study, which, it has now, so that's a study which was commissioned and funded by the EU in order to look into this issue. And it has now gotten a sort of a quasi-official status as a kind of supposedly objective assessment of the Palestinian textbooks, and by extension of the Palestinian narrative, which I think is the first time that there is, European/Western kind of assessment. It's not the first study of the Palestinian textbooks. There have been previous ones, but this one is the one which is seen as like the study now in the EU, and to an extent even abroad, because this issue is actually followed a lot also in other countries, in the US in particular. There was initially some consideration whether to also do a study on the Israeli textbooks, but the EU decided not to do so. I can go more into the debate about that. I think it is a shame that the Institute itself agreed to do this study, which is inherently one-sided, because of course you will find some problems in the textbooks in this kind of a context. The conclusions of the study are really complex. It's not clear-cut. On one hand, they say the textbooks meet the UNESCO standards and there's promotion of peace and human rights. And at the same time, there's a narrative of resistance and promotion of antagonism towards Israel. Which people again politically in politics, they can spin it and selectively quote it whichever way they want. And there has been a real effort since the publication, already before the publication of the study, to spin it in the media as if it confirmed the whole narrative about textbooks systematically, being full of incitement. So there has been this kind of campaign of distortion of the study itself, in addition to a campaign of distorting the content of the textbooks. And I think the study itself is also, in my eyes, definitely reflecting a German political intellectual atmosphere on this issue, which is very limited in a way, and very kind of cautious when it comes to this issue. And I guess everyone is at least a bit familiar with developments in Germany on this topic in recent years, such as a resolution of Bundestag, which is associating the BDS movement with anti-Semitism. I'll give just one example. For example, the study complains about. I will finish them. The study complains about the fact that the Israeli settler organizations in East Jerusalem are called deceptive, as if that was not actually true. If you look at the tactics they have been using, I think anyone who is familiar with that over the last years. But when it comes to, and I will finish after this, they pointed out two examples which they classify as anti-Semitic, one of them being a chapter of a book on Islamic education. But they also said that in the last edition of the textbooks, these examples have been revised or removed. They point to a praise of Dalal Mughrabi. They point to the fact that a lot of maps in those textbooks do not include the Green Line or Israel. We can talk about that maybe more in the debate, so that I finish. There's also, I think interestingly, a whole chapter about the censorship of Palestinian textbooks by Israel in East Jerusalem. But symptomatically, this element of the study is getting zero attention in the follow-up debate. The attention is once again only on the kind of Palestinian side. I will stop here. I hope people will have some comments and questions on the issue, and I will be happy to discuss that further.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you. John, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Teo, for organizing the panel, and to everyone for coming and for all these really engaging contributions. I mean, my few minutes, I'm going to talk about GCSE history in schools in Britain, because the way Palestinian history and the long-standing history of the Palestinian liberation struggle has been taught and presented in those schools is one of the vital stakes of the struggle itself. And I hope that some of the action research that was carried out by myself and Professor James Dickens, who's a professor of Arabic at Leeds University, in coordination with BRICUP, can shed some light on this. So, of course, it might be surprising to some, like in regard to the ongoing occupation and colonization of Palestine, where questions of coercive and economic power are so prominent, where you have interstate alliances and military occupation and massacres and neoliberal capitalism and aid flows and house demolitions and checkpoints and everything else, you also find that, you know, thousands of miles away from Palestine, there's a battle over the seemingly tiny details of school textbooks in Britain, even at the level of GCSE. And this battle over meaning, this cultural battle, is taken very seriously, including by pro-Israel groups such as the Board of Deputies for British Jews and UK Lawyers for Israel. And recently, Defenders of Justice for Palestine, often keyed into the BDS movement and some of the other organizations that are around, have become engaged. And, you know, we heard the name of Gramsci mentioned earlier. As the Italian revolutionary and intellectual Gramsci has taught, the history of subaltern social groups, in this case, the struggle for the emancipation of the Palestinians, is not just a matter of state power and economics, but it is also a matter of culture and civil society. There's a struggle for consent, fought in the fortresses and earthworks and trenches of civil society, i.e. among all those private associations in which consent is organized: schools, unions, charities, NGOs, religious organizations, media companies, political parties, and so on, associations in which the cultural, conceptual, and ideological content of the wider hegemony is defined. This is a struggle over the organization of consent. Antonio Gramsci called it the war of position, and it is as vital for emancipation and oppression as bullets or cash. In this case, the war of position is ongoing, not just in Israel and Palestine itself, but in states in various parts of the world, especially perhaps in ex-colonial Britain, a state that plays an important and, if subordinate, role to the US in reproducing the forms of racism, apartheid, and dispossession that we see in Israel and Palestine. Now, there are modules on Israeli and Palestinian history in British and international GCSE history, which is taught to a few thousand mostly 16-year-old students in several scores of schools in Britain and internationally. And that teaching makes use of a few textbooks. Now, James Dickens, myself, and Brickup have been engaged for over 18 months now as one sort of actor in the trench warfare, this war of position, over 2 GCSE textbooks on the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And in our case, the story begins with a complaint about 2 textbooks, which came from a prominent pro-Israel blogger in 2019. Now, complaints of this kind have become increasingly common and organized in recent years, as we've seen also reflected in the material given in some of the other talks. Now, in this case, new textbooks were issued in 2020 after several months of revision, to the public applause of UK Lawyers for Israel and other pro-Israel groups. Now, given that the original textbooks in this case seemed broadly credible, myself, a professor of Middle East history and politics at ELSC, and James Dickens decided to take a closer look at the revised version, drawing on our expertise. And what we found in a line-by-line comparison of the original version and the revised version was deeply disturbing. First of all, the content of the textbook had been substantially reworked. We found that no fewer than 294 meaningful changes had been made to 80 odd pages of text, a disproportionate and invasive revision. There were numerous pro-Israel distortions, such as absurdities on international law, such as the way Palestinian violence was emphasized while explanations for it were stripped out, and the way Israeli violence was downplayed, explanations for it were developed, and there were interpretations, facts, and perceptions which were cherry-picked to exonerate Israel or to condemn the Palestinians. Now, as a historian, the text read to me as though it had been reworked by lawyers acting as if for a client, Israel, rather than by historians acting to educate school children about a complex history. Second, and equally problematically, we discovered that the pro-Israel lobby groups had been invited into the editorial process, and they'd collaborated with Pearson, the publisher, over many months. No pro-Palestinian groups had been invited to the table. Something, in our view, had gone dangerously wrong. And you know, as Martin has been saying, the EU has been complaining about bias in Palestinian textbooks, but you know, perhaps they should do better to look at textbooks being produced in Britain. But then they would have to park their mission civilisatrice, and so that would presumably cut against some of their fundamentally sort of Orientalist assumptions. But anyway, James Dickens and I, we linked up with colleagues in the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine because we realised we needed support if we were to raise this issue. Pearson is the world's largest education company. But in order to deepen our understanding, we met and corresponded with various parties, including the School Teachers Union, the National Education Union, the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies, the Balfour Project, which is an equal rights organization, an educational charity called Parallel Histories, the author of a similar textbook, and several journalists, above all in The Guardian and The Independent. We published a report on the textbooks and we shared our concerns with Pearson. It's now more than a year later, and Pearson announced in February of 2022 that these dodgy textbooks, didn't call them dodgy textbooks, but it said that they would be withdrawn. And Pearson is now working with Parallel Histories to develop new educational materials on the topic and has reassured James and myself that no lobby groups are involved. So the upshot then in this case is that in this war of position, there has been a tiny incremental gain. A number of pro-Israeli distortions have been weeded out. There has been a certain gain for the position of the historian rather than that of the lawyer or the lobbyist in the editorial process. A major international publisher has, it seems to us, in some part, although rather tacitly, recognized its error and is now corrected it. And a limit has been put on the capacity of pro-Israel groups to change history textbooks as they see fit. Also, other publishers have been put on notice that caving in for legal or reputational reasons to outside pressure is not always the best course of action. Other publishers, such as Hodder, have put out material in the meantime, which is more accurate and in which editorial processes do not include lobbyists, as far as we know. So to conclude, I hope that the action research carried out by James Dickens and me has been able to shed a bit of light on the small corner of this intensive war of position, one small aspect of the Palestinian struggle in general, which of course is fought on many fronts, both local and global. We could also report a tiny and incremental gain in this struggle, but we can still read that as significant insofar as the cultural and organizational battle for consent in civil society is to be taken seriously. The implication is not complacency as the situation continues to get worse. And the example is probably, the situation in general, I mean, and this example is probably only the tip of an iceberg in terms of the size of the problem. And remember, if there is a success, if one trench is taken and small victories are won in the war of position, then there is always the next one, and the struggle doesn't end until liberation or until what both Palestinians and Gramsci called victory. And just allow me to mention at the end that if anyone wishes to support, critical education or action research of the kind described here, then join BRISMES or support BRICUP or get involved with BRISMES campaigns or any of the other organizations that are here today. But thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you. Yara, would you like to come in and bring us together?
Yes, and what a task after all of those brilliant interventions by my colleagues. Please let me know if my internet is not clear. Where to start? Well, my colleagues, outlined many of the difficulties when it comes to teaching Palestine in the UK and beyond, and more recent manoeuvres I think have been particularly troublesome, notably the prevent duty, the IHRA and various other oppressive measures involved in censoring and monitoring. And many of this, of course, stems from the British state and its long-standing foreign policy vis-a-vis the Israeli regime, which has been one of utmost support since its colonial inception. But also, and I think it's becoming clearer, part and parcel of efforts to criminalize domestic protest from a wide range of social justice movements. Now, the reason I mention this foreign policy is because I think it can't be understated that this is also reflected in the academy. The failure to hold Israel accountable and that unwavering support for the Zionist project is, of course, not only based on an ideological alignment, but also very much of foreign policy considerations. And this has been articulated by many British politicians who've stated that, you know, the UK-Israel relationship is really the cornerstone of what the UK does in the Middle East. You know, in other words, that the Israeli regime protects the UK's interests in the region, and so in return, it's vital to protect the Israeli regime. And so, you know, whilst the context of ideological support is crucial to understanding, you know, this current wave of repressive measures against those in support of Palestine, it's also to understand that this falls within the UK's own strategic interest to do so as well. And very grateful to my colleagues to point out that, you know, just by all of this repression, Palestine solidarity activists and allied movements have been pushing back, and indeed in many cases successfully so. And this includes, you know, all the campaigns against the prevent strategy, the refusal in adopting IHRA by students and academics alike, including an important statement by BRISMES, which argued that the definition has been used to target and delegitimize those who support Palestinian rights, and also not, whilst also not adding anything substantive to the fight against racism. There's also been legal pushback, and Giovanni talked about this, legal interventions, which support people against defamation and also in pursuit of upholding the right to boycott. You know, whilst maybe seemingly minor, all of these interventions together create, I think, a very important body of legal precedents, which can be used as defense tools by activist movements, really globally. But the important point I think that Giovanni made is that the collegial support is as important as the legal support to provide camaraderie and a network of allies when people are facing such attacks. And indeed, I think it is necessary to fight against all these repressive measures and attacks in broad intersectional collectives. I think these collectives have the potential to exert more pressure on the government and on academic institutions. But importantly, collectives are rooted in the conviction of the connectedness of our struggles and in a shared belief in resistance to oppression, to censoring, etc. We also heard from Martin about how school books, Palestinian school books, textbooks are used as a pretext to withholding funding for Palestinian assistance and quite often to attack UNRWA, which one of its main service provisions is of course education to Palestinian refugees in and outside of Palestine. And this issue of textbooks has been ongoing for quite some time. But I think it's even more interesting considering the recent news from the UNRWA Commissioner General, who heavily implied that there would be an outsourcing of UNRWA services to other UN agencies, which a lot of people are deeply concerned about, that this will lead to the slow disintegration of UNRWA. And of course, Martin also mentioned that this fixation with Palestinian textbooks is incredibly one-sided, and there's very little scrutiny of Israeli textbooks. And then this brings me on to the next topic, which was discussed, which was, of course, British textbooks by John, and the struggle within the British secondary school system on how Palestine is taught. And one example is a textbook in which pro-Israel revisions were made with complete disregard for international law and completely one-sided, and considering what I mentioned previously about British foreign policy interests and the repressive environment for Palestine solidarity activism, this is not at all surprising. So whilst challenging this repression, the attempts to distort history within institutional spaces is important, it seems to me that we also need to think of what Tamara alluded to, and that's alternative education models on Palestine. And I think this needs to be part and parcel of a wider attempt to decolonize education in the UK. But the perpetual question will always remain: how can we talk about Palestine and the Zionist settler colonial project in the UK when it itself has not come to terms with its own colonial past? In the meantime, there are plenty of organizations which are Palestinian or Palestinian-led that are attempting to not only add to the body of knowledge on Palestine, but also to provide alternative analysis, to promote Palestinian voices, organizations such as MAKAN, but also, and here I will plug my own organization, Al-Shabaka, a policy analysis that is involved in policy analysis. It's a Palestinian-led think tank. So there are plenty of materials out there, and there are plenty of people working on Palestine. And I think curating this knowledge is incredibly important. And I want to thank all my colleagues for all of the efforts that they're doing in the UK. I don't live in the UK, despite my British accent. I live in Palestine, but it is seen and it is heard in Palestine.
Thank you, Yara. That was truly beautiful. Okay, I am going to turn off the recording